So far we've been talking about symmetric encryption, where you're using the same key for both encryption and decryption. But we want to move on to asymmetric encryption. And essentially all you're doing with asymmetric encryption is having a separate key for both decryption and encryption purposes. Now they are interchangeable in the sense that you can use the decryption key for encryption and the encryption key for decryption, and we'll show you why that is the case in a few moments. But for now, let's just think of these two keys as one being for decryption and the other one being for encryption. This has been around since the late 70s. It is a widely used technique for encrypting things, but it's very expensive to do the calculations, and it takes a while. It takes a lot of compute cycles for large messages in particular. So the primary use for asymmetric encryption algorithms is actually to exchange that symmetric key, because if you remember, the biggest challenge with a symmetric key encryption algorithm is that the key has to be exchanged, and if you knew how to exchange the key securely, then you wouldn't need an encryption algorithm. So asymmetric encryption solves that problem by allowing people to exchange keys without having to do a key exchange in advance, right? So you have your encryption key, I have my encryption key, and we can use the public variants of those keys to set up a protocol where we can exchange this symmetric encryption key. Right, so this is all based on this underlying problem of factoring large prime numbers, which you may have heard about. You may know that this is a critical piece of crypto. This is why. It's the asymmetric encryption algorithms that we're using. That's why factoring large prime numbers is such a critical piece of this. Okay, so let's do a very quick dive into RSA, and we're not going to cover all of the mathematics, but I at least want to give you a sense of why it's elegant, why it works the way that it does, and in particular, why the encryption and decryption keys can be interchanged with one another. So the idea is we want to calculate a ciphertext C by doing some math on a plaintext P. And in this particular case, we're taking the message of P and we're turning it into a mathematical value of some sort, right? And raising it to the power of the encryption key, mod n, where n is a very large prime number. And of course, by doing it in this fashion, you can recover the plaintext in an incredibly similar fashion, right? We take the ciphertext and raise it to the power of the decryption key, mod n, right? That really large prime number, and that'll give us the plaintext again, okay? Now, because this is a commutative type process, the mutually inverse commutative process, we can actually do them in either order, right? So we can take p to the ed, or we can take p to the de, right? And that's exactly the same calculation. These are exactly the same. So it doesn't really matter if you're using one key for encrypting and the other one for decrypting. It doesn't really matter what order you're using them in. That they're both going to happen basically at the same time in this mutually inverse and commutative fashion. Okay, now how do we calculate all of the keys that we need? We need to have this encryption key, we need to have the decryption key, and we need to have this large prime number n. Well, deriving the key pair is essentially a simple step-by-step process. Right? We need to have the E and the N, the D and the N, and the value of N has to be a quite large product of two primes, right? This P and Q prime number and that we're trying to calculate. So P and Q are going to be roughly 100 digits long, and so therefore N is going to be this 200 decimal digit, 512-bit long thing, this very large prime number calculation. Now, a large value of N makes it very, very computationally expensive to do the actual encryption, okay? But it's also, because of that, very hard to infer what the P and the Q are. Okay. Now we need these P and Q to calculate the E and the D. So we want a large integer E that is relatively prime to this value here, right? This calculated value here, right? We're using P minus 1 times Q minus 1 to get this relatively prime value for E. And then we're doing the same thing with D. Okay. So essentially, an easy way to guarantee that you get this relatively prime thing is to choose it such that these are the E as a prime, to choose E as a prime that is larger than both P minus 1 and Q minus 1, right? So we can select D using kind of the same thing, where E times D is equivalent to 1 mod this, right? That's how we get the key pairs. So E, D, and N are all related based on this product of two primes, the P and the Q, right? N is just directly a product of two primes, and then E and D are both calculated based on these relatively prime calculations. And relative primeness is actually not that complicated of a mathematical term. 21 and 22 are relatively prime. All it means is that there are no common factors other than 1. So if you think of the factors of 21, you have 1, of course, 3 and 7, right? Because 3 times 7 is 21. And if you think of the factors of 22, you have 1, 2, and 11, right? And of course, the only common factor there is 1, because 3 and 7 are not common with 2 and 11. So that's all relative primeness means. So when we're doing this calculation using our P and our Q to find these relatively prime values E and D, it's really not that big of a deal. The big challenging piece is actually the N, where we're doing this product of two prime numbers, large value. And this step here is really the critical piece from a computational standpoint. This large value of N makes factoring very, very difficult and encrypting very, very expensive from a computational standpoint. So that's really all we're going to do in terms of the math for RSA. I know it's kind of disappointing for some of you who want to dive deep into the mathematics for it. The textbook does give a little bit more detail of this, but this is not a mathematics course. And I really just wanted to show you why this stuff is elegant, namely that you've got this mutually inverse commutative process here that allows you to do the encryption and decryption in either order, and also give you a sense of why these values are all critically dependent upon these two primes, the P and the Q, right? Because they have this inherent relationship between N, D, and E. Okay, so that is asymmetric encryption, primarily just used to exchange a symmetric key and then transfer over to a more efficient symmetric encryption process. Now, we talked in Chapter 2 about message digests and cryptographic hash functions. I'm kind of reminding you of that text now, reminding you of what the use of these things is now, because we need to talk a little bit about digital signatures and how they relate to all of this stuff that we've been mentioning with encryption. So just as a little bit of a recap from Chapter 2, a one-way hash function is essentially just a cryptographic hash function, a one-way hash function and a cryptographic hash function can be used in conjunction with these public key algorithms for encrypting and decrypting digital signatures. Essentially, if you are signing something, you're creating a message digest using your own identity, your own public key, in a way that would not be possible if you were not who you say you were. This is a very valuable tool for integrity checking, as we discussed in Chapter 2, essentially detecting changes to some block of data. That's how these signatures end up working. And there's really two criteria that you need to have. It has to be a one-way function, meaning you convert the input to a digest, but it's impossible to reconstitute the input from the digest. And then there's no obvious collisions, meaning that it would be very unlikely for two separate different inputs to produce exactly the same digest. Okay, and the second one is actually the most problematic of those. Very rarely is anyone going to be in any sort of a position to recover the original input using any modern cryptographic hash function. But coming up with a match of two pairs of inputs that produce the same digest is potentially possible, and actually it has been done. So these are current hash standards. Actually, some of these are deprecated. MD5 and SHA-1 are both deprecated because MD5 and SHA-1 have both been broken in practice, meaning it's possible for somebody to take another input and verify that it can meet the exact same hash as some other given input. They're both broken in practice, so do not ever use MD5 or SHA-1. Unfortunately, they're kind of still in use in some places, I'm sure. SHA-1 was only broken a couple of years ago, so I'd be stunned if it has been completely removed from service altogether. But you really should be using something like one of the SHA-2 algorithms, probably SHA-2 256 or better for new stuff, because SHA-1 is broken. MD5 has been broken for a long time. Okay, so what do we use a digital signature for? Well, there are basically two requirements that you desperately have to have. and then two requirements that you'd really, really like to have. So the mandatory ones are the top two. It has to be unforgeable, meaning that nobody else can produce this signature, right? You have to have the signer's private key. And this is kind of why we needed to recover a little bit about the hash functions we talked in chapter 2, where you've got these two criteria. One way, cannot recover the input, and no obvious collisions, right? We really want to make sure that that is not possible. We also need to make sure they're authentic, meaning the receiver can actually verify that this signature really came from the signer. Typically, that piece depends on public key infrastructure, the ability to do some kind of a key exchange. If I have a private key that I'm using to create a digital signature, then you need my public key to be able to verify that it's actually authentic, right? If you don't have my public key, this second criteria disappears. And then we have these two desirable criteria. We want to make sure that it is not possible to alter in any way the message, the signature, or any of this other stuff without having that alteration be obvious, right? Tamper evidence is kind of the key here. And then this last criteria, we want to make sure that a digital signature is not reusable. So if you tried to reuse the digital signature, it would fail, and you wouldn't be able to actually verify the message. Okay, so this is the goal with the digital signature. How do we actually compute them? Well, the general way of doing this is very simple. You're basically doing public key encryption. The signer computes a signature based on their private key, and then others can use the public key to verify the signature came from the corresponding private key. Essentially, you're using your private key as if it were a hash function that can be verified using the public key somewhere else in the PKI, somewhere else in the public key exchange process. Okay, so that is everything that we wanted to talk about with asymmetric encryption using RSA. We'll move into very briefly elliptical curve crypto systems and then talk about the implications of quantum crypto on all of this stuff in the next set of slides.